Hey, Navindu.
Hi Lee,
Hey.
how are you doing?
Good. Good. You can't ask me questions like that because I'm likely to complain. Like it just opens up gives me all the room I need. Very good. So it's 3 after. Shriti, if you are ready, we're probably good to go.
Hey, welcome everybody. This is the Meshery development meeting where we discuss everything related to and projects around Meshery. If you haven't been with us before, please go ahead, introduce yourself. If you do not see your name in this attendees list, which I just updated, please go ahead and add it. It basically means that you have been with us. It's proof in writing. If you have any other topics, please go ahead and add them to the agenda, and we'll round up to them. With 3 minutes in, that's a safe enough time to start, I guess. Any latecomers can join us as we proceed. Utkarsh, do you want to start off with yours?
Yeah, sure. So should I share my screen? And
Yeah,
am I audible?
Yeah, you are. And yes, sure, go ahead. Share your
Okay.
screen.
So my screen is visible, right?
Yep.
Okay, so basically I was working on this service mesh control plane UI. Uh, Basically what it does is it adds tables where we are trying to show the components that are deployed, basically components in each service mesh that are deployed on the cluster. So yeah, basically I'm trying to demo it, and I am facing an issue which I would also like to talk about. Let me first like kind of show how it works. Yes, basically this is a part of addition. Actually, initially you might have seen that this was just a single pane and the connection status, and basically it was a grid view. Right now there are two different panes. One is service mesh, which is basically to show all the active service meshes in here, and this one is the like just the usual one which we used to have. Okay, it's taking some time.
All right. While we wait for these mesh to be installed.
Yeah, it's still taking a lot of time to install for some
No
reason.
issues. It's probably a connection issue. Not your fault. Uh, are there any other changes? This looks pretty good, by the way.
Yeah, sorry.
Are there any other changes to the UI? This looks pretty good.
Actually, the only thing that would that would happen in here after Istio is deployed is that there would be some tables in here which would basically show the components. Nothing else. Yeah, basically nothing else at the moment. It would look kind of like this. You can see this, like this.
Looks good. Maybe try one of the other meshes if you want to do
Yeah,
it.
actually, it's actually I am like looking at it. It's deploying itself. Okay, it's taking a lot of time. Okay. Yeah, so basically, this is what I was working on. This basically what it does is it uses a mesh sync API to basically scan the mesh service meshes, and it grabs all the components that we can scan, and it shows in here. It supports multiple namespaces if the component exists in multiple namespaces, and obviously it would support multiple service meshes too. But I don't know how long it would take to deploy. I think. Okay, so it's taking very long. Should I like discuss the issue that I was facing in here?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so basically, no, it wasn't. Yeah, so basically, when I deploy a network service mesh, it's quite fast. It de basically it deploys itself quite quickly, and it's still coming.
So here, while we're staring at the screen, watching the paint dry, here is an opportunity for feedback to the user about the progress of an operation. In a poor man's way, or rather, I should say, we implemented something of a poor man's work in progress indicator in the past, and that was to use the toaster notification to let people know that they've submitted an operation for execution, that it had been received and it was being processed. But to the extent that that includes like downloading a release, deploying a mesh, to the extent that it takes a few minutes, users are left questioning what's going on. There's a call for and a need for a queue, an operations queue, a task queue, and also a need for us to kind of stop abusing toaster notifications. It's a bit much. But
All right.
just
yeah.
comments from the
Anybody?
peanut gallery.
Sure. Same.
Okay, I think it's deployed now. And we don't have anything here. Okay, so let's get. When as you just saw that I deployed NSM, and trust me, it did got deployed. So what happens is the mesh scan API returns information about Istio, Linkerd, and NSM. In NSM, basically in the response object, I could not find the version that the NSM is running. So basically the version of NSM, as you can see here, you can see that I am displaying the versions of these components for Linkerd for Istio system as they were mentioned in the component in the response that the mesh scan API basically returns. But in case of NSM, I could not actually find any version. Basically, I couldn't find any version anywhere in this whole response object. So this is something that I was seeking help with. Actually, I posted about in basically Slack too. Uh, but yeah, if anyone has any input or any idea that how we can basically grab the version of NSM, like really helpful because that's exactly what's holding on this particular PR from draft to be finalized.
So it's a good question. Actually, for anyone that's familiar with Kubernetes, in general, like, is there a uniform way to ascertain the version of a given piece of, or of a given, yeah, I guess, of a given deployment? I guess that there isn't, because that's all project specific. It depends upon whether or not that particular pod or deployment that as a project has a version. So it's possible to deploy things that don't necessarily have versions. Almost all, or the vast majority of software that is deployed does. Many of them will include that version number in the image tag, which has been, I think, the point of reference for the other service meshes. NSM isn't following. I guess, Utkarsh, is it just have you inspected the pods that are not in this deployment, but rather there's a few pods that get deployed separately outside of a deployment?
No, actually, all I've like right now taken a look at is this particular mesh scan API. Along with that, I was also working on, like we talked earlier, that I was working on. Basically, I was trying to modify mesh scan API to behave kind of like kubectl get pods hyphen capital A. So that's what I was trying. I was working on. And there's actually API in K's Go client for that. That might help us. But basically, what I'm trying to say is I haven't yet looked in the pods that are deployed other than this mesh scan response.
Do these service mesh control planes have some kind of API or an endpoint or CLI tool which returns the version?
Yeah, this is an older version of NSM. At the time, we started supporting NSM before they had a Helm chart, and then refactored after they did provide a Helm chart. So you would think, like, if they were curating their Helm chart well, they would include a version in there, which might be deposited as like an annotation somewhere. It's been a long time since I've looked at, I don't know if they have a CLI or if they have other API, like control plane APIs. I don't know.
Yeah, like OSM, Linkerd, Istio seem to have some kind of endpoint way to send a request to the control plane. So even if we were doing it through port forwarding, but I haven't played with NSM at all.
So for my part, I tossed in a question over to the core maintainer of NSM just a little bit ago. So as soon as he reports, so his name's Ed, by the way, and he's in our Slack. As soon as he reports back, hopefully he'll just report it in the Slack, but I guess that's about as much info as I have. To Nitish's point, like, hey, outside of like looking at the image for a version number, while that seems to be convention, that most projects will do that. That isn't the case for NSM and is not, there's no standard there. So like, and really if you're going to interface deeply with a service mesh, like interfacing with its control plane, with its API, hopefully with an API there is what you're going to want to do anyway. I agree. So I've got, just to finish this up, I guess I've got NSM deployed here. This is it's an older version of NSM. Like I don't, maybe 9 months. I'm not entirely sure. So if we look at this for a moment, just because this particular pod is not part of the deployment that Utkarsh was just looking at. And so maybe this pod has a bit more information than that deployment. Just do a quick look, and if it's not in here, then we should move on to another topic. There's quite a few annotations. Yeah, it may be that this was just before that. I'm assuming that they've matured as a project at this point, and that there is an easy answer. But I guess, you know, part of you showing the work there was, I think it was kind of two things. I mean, one is that you are asking for, you know, some guidance, you know, some folks like Nitish to chime in and suggest some intelligent things to go do. But then the other part was, I don't know that we've really talked about those new dashboards, and if people have been given an opportunity to comment on them. So Utkarsh, like, did you want to share your screen real quick again? And does anyone have feedback for Utkarsh on those dashboards? Those. Well, I do. And that is, and that is that, these have been much needed. That it might have been unknown to a lot of us that underneath the covers, Meshery has been aware of whether or not a service mesh is present in the environment. It's been able to brownfield a service mesh deployment for a really long time. And that knowledge, which had yet to be exposed in the UI. And along comes Utkarsh, who's, you know, capable on front end and back end, and is kind of tying this off. Really helpful, really changes turns the page for Meshery, such that it's no longer something of, for my part, and this would, something of an embarrassment that Meshery doesn't, you know, wasn't necessary, or that users didn't know that Meshery is aware of the fact that a service mesh was deployed, or the fact that it had just deployed one. And this is, so what's being shown here is really just the start to a bunch of other information and things to expose, ways of interacting with a service mesh that has been deployed. And that's really irrespective of whether or not Meshery has deployed it or someone else has. So this is the most basic visual representation of, you know, information specific to a given deployment. So Utkarsh has made sure that that if there are, that if you have more than one service type of service mesh deployed. That information about it will be shown here. Utkarsh, I don't know. I think the design is such that if there were two instances of a given mesh on the same cluster, users should be able to switch between those two instances using the namespace dropdown. And I don't know that that's been tested, but from what I've seen of the code, that should work just fine.
I couldn't get your question. Basically, I couldn't get that thing that
sure.
multiple instances are deployed in the same cluster. Like I couldn't basically understand that.
No problem. I'll mention it in the Slack so that everybody doesn't have to hear me drone on. The last thing I would say is that someone had seen this recently and suggest or asked the question of like, hey, wouldn't it make sense if those, I'm not sure these cards, these small dashboards, these panels, if you will, were inside of like if you were to click on Istio on the menu item, wouldn't it make sense to show that in there? And like, yeah, it does. As a matter of fact, I'll get real nuanced here if I can. And if I use the correct language, maybe this will resonate with everyone. And I'll start by saying there's a lot of things that are wrong or not well done in the UI here. So Utkarsh, if you don't mind, if you go back to just the top level dashboard, that for the longest time, Meshery, the title of this interface was called Dashboard. And what it showed is how well Meshery is doing and whether or not Meshery and its adapters are connected to a cluster or to Prometheus and Grafana, things like that. That's helpful information, although ideally that's sort of stuffed somewhere else. Like ideally, most people don't really care and don't need to use it because Meshery is just up and working and is connected to things. That information, the connection status column, the right-hand side column, is probably, much of that is probably moved into the system, the settings, the upper right-hand corner gear, like, because that's just like about the gears where you go to configure Meshery. But this connection status information could also be moved into that gear. So Utkarsh, if you don't mind hitting the gear. Yeah. So if you can imagine the connection status items showing up over here, some of them already do, like that kind prod, that chip is the same chip that's shown on the system dashboard. So, but what should be shown, and feel free anyone to disagree or suggest something else, but what should be shown if you go back to the main dashboard is that no longer would it be called system dashboard because it wouldn't be about Meshery, the system. It would be called service mesh dashboard or just dashboard. And it would be much more about the things that people are using Meshery to do, which is much more about how's the health of my, how many service meshes do I have? How many workloads do they have? How healthy are they? What are they doing? Can I, just all the litany of things that that Meshery is gonna enable. And that, so that's sort of a preview of kind of the thinking there. On the left-hand side, the menu is, it needs to change, like the whole thought that when you go to click on a service mesh name on the left-hand side, what's really happening is that the architectural components of Meshery are being displayed in a very thin, with a very thin veneer. Basically, you're clicking on, what's happening here is like as a user, you're clicking on an adapter. And if you understand the system, it becomes very apparent that that's what you're doing. And it's more about interfacing with an adapter than and Utkarsh, if you don't mind, like click on any one of the service mesh names. You're clicking on an adapter and you're being shown what is possible, what the adapter is capable of. And again, this is just like all the community could do at the time. The community is much stronger now. There are many more and some bigger or a lot bigger brains here working on the project. to the extent that like, hey, these are features and things and ways in which you can affect a service mesh. But what you'd show here would be like all of the things about the service mesh that are going on. And the way that you apply configuration should be done in a much more specific way, much more surgical way. So Utkarsh, if you click on the plus sign on apply service mesh configuration, I don't remember it. So you can annotate, like some of this is okay, but what if you only wanted to annotate like not the namespace, but something else, or there's not many controls. So this is what I'm saying is the whole UI needs to change. Some of you are working on a visual UI for that. The fact that, yeah, anyway, all kinds of things need to change. And so for my part, I'm really excited to see Meshery turn a page, like start a new chapter by showing information back from the environment, showing the fact that there are any number of service meshes deployed. Cool. So, you know, anyway, people have, there's lots of management software out there. This is a piece of management software. If people have opinions and thoughts and things that should be exposed or the way in which they should, or different components that should be used, never hesitate. We'll give 30 seconds to the question. Does anyone have any feedback for Utkarsh? Else? So here, I've got a question for everyone, and if you think about the answer to this question and you don't really have, if something doesn't come to mind for you, maybe we should talk, because I think that everyone might have an opinion here. So here's a question, Utkarsh. I don't know if you can make it such that the dashboard says there are no service meshes installed.
Yeah, I can basically uninstall the Meshery.
Oh, okay. Or just if there's a screenshot or something, just.
Yeah, actually I.
Oh, cool. So when people install Meshery, if a service mesh isn't present, what you'll see instead of information about a given mesh, you'll see it'll say, there's no service mesh here. Click this button to install one. And that's the question to all of you. What do you think should happen when you click that button? What would you ideally like to see when you click deploy a service mesh?
Yeah, here it is. It's a bit old because like now I have increased the space in here, but other than that, it's quite similar.
All right, so I will tell you what you should expect when you click the button. And then I'll say this, and then tell me if you think that feels right or feels wrong. So one, understand that what you're doing here is you're clicking this button in context of a Kubernetes cluster already. So in this case, Meshery is already connected to a Kubernetes cluster. And so soon Meshery will support connections to multiple clusters at the same time. But even when it does, it should be well understood, and it should really be the case that Meshery has, well, this isn't the way to say it. Meshery should have active connections to every Kubernetes cluster that it's touching. But that said, from a user experience, it should be either implicit and well understood that operations that the user is invoking are being done in context of a particular cluster, or every time that a user goes to invoke an operation, that they are asked to confirm what cluster and what context in that cluster, or I shouldn't say context in that cluster. I mean, what cluster, what context they're looking to invoke that operation against. In this case, Meshery only supports connection to a single cluster at a given time. So it's not that big of a deal. But so when right now it says that the kind prod cluster is where you're connected. So you click install service mesh, and you'd probably, like if it's a decent experience, there's probably more novel ways of doing this, but the user would probably be shown something of an installation wizard, like a multi-step thing where they answer a couple of questions. And that is like, well, pick your service mesh of choice. Like which one did you want to deploy? Good. Did you have a profile? Choose from this default set of profiles. It may be a profile that you've previously configured, so that then the service mesh will be deployed under that configuration. If ultimately, if the user didn't like that profile, that they should be able to say, advanced or edit or something, or either import their own Helm values, or to just have a lot of questions in a forum asked of them about the deployment. Like, did you want MTLS or did you want these things? And then they go to next. And it might be you want to make that type of a thing as short as possible, but it would be just sort of confirming the namespace, and really just like options that are configuration options that are specific to that mesh. Anyway, that's off the top of my head. That's what I'm thinking people would probably ideally expect. Today, if you click on the button in the current release of Meshery, Utkarsh, do you mind showing them what it takes them to?
Actually, I will have to first uninstall those meshes so that I can access. I can do that, but it will definitely take.
No, it's okay. No, you don't have to. Actually, all I meant was just to go to /management.
Oh.
It'll take them to here. Today, when you click the button, it takes you to there, which is all right. Like, hey, it is that first choice of like, it's trying to ask you what service mesh would you like to install, but instead it's asking you to choose an adapter. It's like, too much of the back end nerd knobs, too much of the back end constructs being exposed here. So, okay, good. So since I've been monologuing for a while and I don't know that others have comment, we should definitely go to the next topic.
Okay, thank you, Kush. Kush can't make it today, I guess. So moving on. Latish, is this yours? On guard?
Yeah, that's so Lee, do you want to lead this?
Yeah, sure. So by the way, I think, I don't know if, so this item here, it might just be sort of a proclamation or an announcement that for a long time, Meshery's compatibility with AKS hadn't been confirmed. And Kush recently did, and he augmented Meshery CTL to help with the configuration of the user's kube config file to have the right credentials to Azure. So Meshery CTL wraps the Azure, the AZ CLI, the Azure CLI. It also wraps the GCP CLI, and it wraps Minikube as well to help facilitate Meshery's connection to each of those Kubernetes environments. It is notably missing EKS in there. And if anyone has noticed, Amia, who's a community member, he wants to present Meshery. Actually, I think he's going to present Meshery to Telstra or to some folks at Telstra, and he wants to do it on EKS, and so he's going to have to do some manual things. So if anyone was looking for a challenge, and it's not a big one, is to volunteer to and so all that would do is run a small bash script. And there's examples of how to do that, of Meshery CTL doing that for GKE and others. If it's of interest to you, please signal. So Nitish has written an open source project called OnGuard or Envoy OnGuard, which is really helpful to those that are running any service mesh that's uses Envoy as its data plane. OnGuard as a project. It's funny, Nitish, you get to hear someone else explain what your project does. Envoy as a project will make it really easy for people and systems to read Envoy logs. Envoy produces a voluminous amount of voluminous, or however you say that, amount of logs, and it does so in its own log format. And so OnGuard takes advantage of kubectl logs and takes advantage of JQ as a way of filtering through JSON. As OnGuard will reformat Envoy's logs in JSON so that those logs are a lot easier to deal with. And as we're looking at the user experience in Meshery and part of its functionality, it's like if Meshery is showing you that there are certain service meshes deployed, you might want to look at the logs from the data plane of any of those service meshes or from the control plane. And so recently, we were just kind of chatting about the potential use of OnGuard within Meshery. And part of that discussion was potentially having OnGuard as a library in each adapter. So potentially in the Meshery adapter library, or maybe even in MeshKit. But and that's about as far as we've gotten in the discussion. And so part of the thinking had been, I think it was there's a collection of people that on Tuesday's call that were kind of coming out to understand OnGuard's capabilities and how it sort of sits in the middle between kubectl logs, OnGuard, and JQ. And looking at over the use cases, one of the things that would be ideal is, given that there is, to the extent that Meshery's UI exposes all of Envoy's logs, which there's a lot, empowering the user with the ability to filter those logs is pretty important. As a matter of fact, telling the Meshery adapter, which in turn would interface with OnGuard to, hey, receive logs from 10 envoys or one envoy, or maybe pre-filter. And actually, Nitish, I'm somewhat ignorant here. I realize this isn't really a capability of OnGuard per se, but of Envoy, you can tell it. I'm assuming there's different log streams that you can enable.
You just have, if I remember correctly, there's I think there's only one set of logs that you get from Envoy, and it's structured logging. I don't know if you could filter the logs through Envoy. This is just everything that it's spitting out, but you can change the debug levels. And I just wanted to add that OnGuard is pretty generic. It uses grokking that I think comes from Elastic. So it is extendable to be, it can be used beyond Envoy as well. So as long as we have structured logging, from any of the proxies or sidecars, whatever service mesh we're using, predictable structured logging, then we can use the grokking pattern to do this. Some of them are just going to have like output in JSON, and then that should be straightforward where you pipe it through JQ.
Yeah, it's interesting, Nitish, when you think about use cases that are not specific to Envoy. I'm curious, has anyone worked with Loki before?
Loki is for Prometheus?
Maybe I'm getting confused. I thought it was. I thought it was.
Yeah, Prometheus.
Yeah,
oh, Prometheus, but for logs. Okay.
Loki is a horizontally scalable, highly available multi-tenant log aggregation system inspired by Prometheus. And so, I don't know. Just I think in part of the attraction. So does OnGuard have any? No. Yeah, I asked this question the other day. OnGuard is laser focused on taking the format of the structured log format of well maybe I should rephrase this. Like, is there anything in OnGuard that is specific to Envoy, like either the understanding of the structure or there's no
Yeah, there is like the grokking pattern. It just knows what the standard Envoy logs, these fields are defined, and that's how it groks for those patterns. And like Istio has a couple of more fields defined on top of Envoy logs. So we have another grokking pattern for Istio.
Are you impressed that I remember your call sign?
Yes.
Good. Nice.
So if you look at that tweet from MeshKit, this is the predictable pattern that's used. And it's always ordered in that way.
Yeah, this is interesting. And byte sent duration.
Yep.
So yeah, this is it's like an actually useful version of an Apache.
Exactly.
So yeah, Michu, does this like conceptually the capability that we're talking about, or sort of the functionality that we're discussing, does that use case make sense? Did the suggestion that potentially the adapters are the place to host this also make sense?
I think so. I mean, the adapters should be the one who know the log structures and are essentially just massaging it and sending it over, sending it via, sending it in the JSON structure. So I think it makes sense, just so that we can have some uniformity in what's being served to the Meshery server or to the UI.
Yeah, I also think it makes sense. I miss getting a bit more information back from somewhere anyway. That helps to, debug or troubleshoot as well.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, Abhishek, you had mentioned maybe, so if that sounds about right, the one place to potentially look at incorporating in that functionality would be in Meshery adapter library, or another place might be an echelon, a level up in MeshKit. Is there an argument for MeshKit? Someone has been.
I mean, would you like to have sort of like, be able to have one collect logs from different places in one place, have like one channel or queue, or using nuts for this maybe, so one place to look for different logs from different places. Also, when we, I'm sure you're also getting logs that we would like to use for troubleshooting in Meshery itself.
Right. Yep. And there's another use case is, and it's not one that we're trying to be or necessarily trying to become, but often you're operating your service mesh in context of Kubernetes. And so receiving and seeing Kubernetes logs or Kubernetes events in general, we're not, we didn't set out, we're not setting out for Meshery to be a rancher, so to speak, but for Kubernetes, a management system for Kubernetes. The thing to your point though is that much of what we're doing is done in context of Kubernetes, and so like actually there's use cases where you'd want to see that as well. Fluency being sort of the very popular mechanism for facilitating the ingest, transformation, and transmission of logs in a Kubernetes cluster. Nitish, had you considered or like a Fluency plugin?
Not so far. I mean, this is a pretty quick hack of a project just to do some debugging, but yeah, it could possibly be part of another project that would that could import the packages, and we could build something better than this. I mean, the another thought was just submitting the grokking pattern to Elastic, or make that part of their standard way of grokking Envoy logs, and then you could leverage Fluency, and Elastic for these kind of for these purposes. There's nothing extraordinary about this project other than it's just defined basically the pattern for Envoy using their grepping language.
Nice. I think we have a winning, like there's a need here, and as a matter of fact, starting small in many respects is quite nice. Anirudh, who is still on the call, has been working on interfacing more deeply with the Kubernetes Go client for some streaming use cases. And so logs being very related to that. And so it should be the case that relatively soon Meshery would have entered into being capable of streaming information back and forth from Kubernetes, and then applying, and then that facilitates this use case. Like even if
Hello.
Nitish could be a way of warming up those fingers. It could be bringing your words per minute back up a bit. Just to.
Yep.
So nice. I think that's the discussion. Like I think what would put, there's a possible future in a year from now, in 6 months from now or something, if it might be the case that there's a ton of feedback and people are saying, wow, these logs are really helpful. There's use cases immediately around being able to control just how much logs are being streamed so that the system works somewhat efficiently. And those are easy enough to get to. I mean, those are kind of near term. Those are small in size. Long term, people could come over and say, well, while these are really helpful, what I'm actually also really missing here is the fact that there's some other event going on in the system, and I need to take a look at that. It's a Kubernetes log, or it's something that I could get out of Fluentd. And so I'd like to also funnel those through here as well, or into Meshery's UI as well. And also, by the way, this happened 2 days ago. So I'd really like to go back in time and look at that. And like, that's something like, well, okay, so let's go take a look at Loki or something else, because this is a much bigger thing. The immediate, there is a ton of immediate value in what's having been done in OnGuard, which is Meshery's UI runs in React, and like other front-end frameworks, React has a lot of libraries for manipulating JSON. So getting a structured log and converting it into JSON, really helpful for the presentation of logs. So I think we should go try to do what we were just talking about here, either incorporating this into the Meshery adapter library or MeshKit, and then as Meshery's interaction with Kubernetes is increased, and we're able to signal to Kubernetes that we'd like for a log stream. Oh, so I guess Nitish, no, it is. It's signaling to Kubernetes to have it send logs over. Yeah. Anybody see that differently? Like any caveats that like why this isn't a good idea? Okay. Nitish, we should go do something? Does that sound like the plan?
Yes. Definitely.
Nice. All right. Hey, briefly, of the folks that are on the call, did anyone raise their hand on Get Nighthawk? And if not, then I won't, bore everyone. Navindu, you were conscripted, even if you didn't raise your hand, I remember. So because there's only one of you on the call, let's not make everyone else listen to it, but rather we'll put a link to this forthcoming project. It has gotten positive feedback. There's a collection of about 6 to 8 community members here who have raised their hand to work on this project. And the core Nighthawk maintainers have been quite positive on this proposal. It's a small proposal. If you're familiar with Get Envoy, this is a Get Envoy, but for Nighthawk. So project is just kind of forming now. So if it's of interest to folks, there's things to do. It's mostly around, yeah, it's a small in nature project, but there's still a lot, there's still enough for like 8 people or so. Sweetie, that's all I had.
All right, then that's the end of our agenda today. Thank you, Nitish, for coming on. See you in the next call. Thank you, everybody, for coming on. See you next week. Same time.
Nice. Thank you, Shriti.
Bye.
See you all. Happy Wednesday.
Yeah, bye guys.
Bye.